Welcome to SIIMcast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging Informatics in Medicine.
Welcome to SIIMcast. This is Jason, and in this episode, we're going to continue our mini-series in which we interview a chapter author from the Practical Imaging Informatics textbook. Today, we're covering Chapter 10, Ancillary Services, and we'll be chatting with Dr. Tessa Cook. Dr. Cook is an associate professor of radiology at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia and vice chair of practice transformation in the Department of Radiology. She's an active member of multiple radiology societies, including the RSNA, ACR, SIIM, and AUR. She's the director of the Imaging Informatics Fellowship and modality chief of 3D and Advanced Imaging. Dr. Cook is the chair of the Society for Imaging Informatics in Medicine. In 2020, she was inducted into the College of SIIM Fellows and received SIIM's Dr. Ruth Dayhoff Award for the Advancement of Women in Medical Imaging Informatics. She pursues innovative methods to enhance care delivery in radiology and improve radiologist workflows. So with that said, let's get into this episode and get to know a little bit more about the ancillary services that exist across the imaging workflow. Welcome to SIIMcast, and with us we have Tessa Cook, a friend of the pod, and we're continuing our mini-series interviewing the authors of the Practical Imaging Informatics textbook, and when Tessa authored Chapter 10, which was on ancillary services. And before we get into the questions, Tessa, would you mind just kind of setting the table and explaining what that means, ancillary services, in the context of radiology workflow, and what were some of the core concepts that you wanted to touch on in your chapter?
Sure, Jason. So, we think of the core software that we use in radiology, right? RIS, PACS, the EMR, thin client post-processing applications. These software applications I discussed in Chapter 10 were sort of the other things that, at least at the time, didn't necessarily fall in the category of those critical things. Although maybe some of them now you could argue, like radiation exposure monitoring software, is far more critical than it might have been a little over a decade ago. But I talked about a lot of the solutions that we ended up building because we didn't find suitable alternatives, available for purchase. So a lot of things related to resident education, follow-up monitoring, at the time, radiation exposure monitoring, non-critical actionable findings notifications, things like that.
Terrific. Okay. And so you've touched on a lot there. Maybe we could start out just talking about that. You mentioned radiation exposure management, and you can discuss the importance in the implementation of REM tools and modern radiology practices. But I'd also love to hear kind of the hype cycle that we see on some of these things. Is about a decade ago, we might not have seen a high adoption rate of REM solutions, but we definitely heard a lot about it from marketing teams. And it seems like we don't hear about that as much from solutions that are being provided. So I'm hitting you with kind of two questions there, but yeah, maybe the importance, and we see things kind of tail off sometimes that are still very important.
For sure. Yeah. So I think what was happening, a little over 10 years ago now was there was a series of New York Times articles about patients having adverse reactions after CT, notably after CT perfusion, CT angiography of the head. And there were a few cases where patients just got more radiation exposure than they should have, and they had hair loss and very obvious reactions as a result of that. And that, I think, really lit a fire under our community in imaging informatics and in radiology to say, you know what, we can do better here. And how can we do better? And, oftentimes in our fields, the first thing is, well, where's the data? We do a lot with data and evidence. And that's when we realized this particular data was really hard to get to. And so even though it started with the hype, as many things do, and, we can't turn around without seeing AI and large language models, and, that's the newest hype cycle, but it was warranted in this particular case. And I think the reason we don't see or hear about it nearly as much to the same degree anymore is that Now it's part of business as usual, as it probably always should have been. It just took us a little while to get there. And so these solutions now are often part of a package that you might get if you buy a new CT scanner, or you buy a new piece of IR equipment, a new C-arm, if you buy sometimes even a new PACS. And so it's really considered, even though, 10 to 15 years ago, it really was an ancillary system. And that was when we had our experience of really having to build something because there weren't solutions out there. Now, I would say it's one of the core applications. Why is it important? Because it really affects the way that we deliver care and is a big part of delivering good care, because we need to make sure that our protocols are designed to answer the clinical question without using more radiation than is necessary. And as soon as you've got multiple CT scanners, multiple fluoroscopic units, multiple C-arms, and from multiple vendors, that starts to get really challenging to manage without some sort of cohesive solution.
Thank you, Tessa. And along the same lines, you were saying about radiation exposure monitoring being something that was hot, let's say a decade ago, and now it's just a fact of life. I feel like a few years ago, we were all hearing about the pains of installing clinical decision support systems, and now it's kind of quieted down. So I'm wondering if A, this is now the same thing, and B, in the process, maybe you could just tell us about how that's influenced decision-making in radiology, especially in the context of Medicare and other insurance providers.
Yeah, it's interesting, Mohamed. I feel like that one's a little bit different because even though radiation exposure monitoring was really driven by the community, CDS was driven, certainly in the US, by CMS, by the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, telling us, all right, this is something we're going to require you to do. If your ordering clinicians are not using a qualified clinical decision support mechanism, you, the radiologist, are not going to get reimbursed for that exam. And so they sort of created this incentive much more for us than our clinical colleagues to say, okay, well, we need to make sure there's a CDS solution in place. We need to teach our colleagues how to use it. We need to figure out what happens if we get an order that doesn't have an approval code. It was driven in a very different way. And we've been talking about it. I think PAMA was 2014, the Protecting Access to Medicare Act, that kind of set all of this in motion. So it's been almost a decade for that too, except now CMS is saying, you know what? We tried to do this and it was hard and we're not quite sure we've done it the right way. So we're not going to require it yet. And some version of that message we've been hearing since 2014. As well, it's not going to be next year, but it'll be the year after. No, it's not going to be that year. It's going to be the year after. And even, at the beginning of this year, we thought, okay, well, January of 24. And I think in July, CMS said, nope, not January of 24. They didn't actually, to the best of my knowledge, they didn't come out and say it'll be January of 25, which was a little bit of a different response this year than in past years. But it's certainly important, because we want to make sure that, again, it's part of delivering good care to make sure that when there's a clinical question, that we are doing the right test that answers that. Is CDS implemented right now in the best way to make that happen? I think a lot of people would probably say no, because there are ways to get the test that you want, even if it's maybe not the right test to answer the question, and you can sort of game the system a little bit. So we're still waiting to figure out what the best way of doing this for our patients is, but there's a reason that we're trying to achieve.
That's really interesting, Tessa. Thank you for the clarification. I actually assumed it went a little quiet, mostly because it was done. I don't follow that type of news often. I am curious, though. So the delays here, in your opinion, do you feel like it's got to do with the maturity of the technology that's available as far as integration, or is it the maturity of the technology as far as offering good clinical decision support systems and recommendations?
I think it's a bit more the latter, Mohamed. I think the technology was implemented pretty well. There were CDS applications long before CMS started paying attention to this. They just weren't widely used. And the intent is noble, right? Get the patient the right test to answer the question that their clinician is asking. The problem is when you put a hard stop in the clinical workflow, it makes the person on the other end of that hard stop very unhappy, even if you're doing it for noble reasons. And also then, on top of that, CMS created this really odd incentive, putting the burden of doing this on the radiology community rather than on the clinicians that are actually ordering the exams. So I think it's not so much about giving the right advice, because we have ACR appropriateness criteria that are, expert defined and developed with a really rigorous cycle. I think part of it is in how we've just implemented the expectations of CDS. It's not so much about the software and the technical pieces. It's really more about the philosophy of it, if you will. I'm not sure that that's quite the right word, but it's our collective approach to doing this, I think, that needs to be thought through again.
I'm curious. So I'll throw another one that's kind of maybe a well-intended application or use that we don't see well adopted. Is in your chapter, you mentioned the educational tools and then discrepancy tracking systems. So things like peer review, or we often hear them kind of relabeled as peer education.
Peer learning, yep.
Peer learning. So in Ontario, this made a lot of attention because there was a bad consequence that happened at a Toronto-based hospital. And as a result, a government agency got involved and nothing kind of came of it. There was action towards regionalizing peer review and making it following the ACR guidelines and making it anonymous truly. But it's hard to find, I guess, the adoption on it. And without hearing bad things happening and getting reported on the front page of the news, we don't see that traction again. I'm curious your perspective of kind of where you see peer learning, peer review kind of fitting into this.
Yeah, that's, I think, even a third sort of different example with a different set of motivations and incentives. Again, it all comes down to, we all want to do the right thing for the patient. We are all human. People make mistakes, but mistakes are opportunities to learn and do better the next time. And I think a lot of what has changed, and, Jason, you alluded to peer review versus peer learning or peer education. There's been this emphasis in the last probably couple of decades on just culture, right? You don't punish the person who made the mistake because they didn't intend, there wasn't a malicious intent behind the error. It was a mistake. The idea that there are two victims, so to speak, the patient who, could have been harmed or maybe was harmed is one, but the person who made the mistake that led to that patient getting harmed is also another. And then there's also an increased focus on, system-based errors, right? Because again, a lot of times when mistakes happen, it's not that, it was just someone being sloppy or careless or lazy or whatever. A lot of times our systems are not set up to help us do the right thing all the time. And so more and more the just culture effort, and I'm not sure I've totally done it justice. This is my, sort of non-expert understanding of this, but, there are folks like Dr. Jen Broder who are far more eloquent in speaking about this than I am. But I think that's where we've gone from peer review, which has this sort of, almost punitive connotation to it, to peer learning. Let's take this opportunity to learn and understand why something happened and how we can avoid it in the future. And so, again, it's a thing that we should all be doing, and I think there's certainly, guidance from organizations like the ACR about sort of how to approach the process. But there are also, as you say, a lot of criticisms of, trying to do it in a way that is non-punitive because it has had this kind of punitive connotation to it for so long. Really, it's pushing against the grain of what many people are used to say, no, we are taking a different approach to this. This is an opportunity for learning.
Could you imagine an opportunity where AI could improve this and help on that educational side more? And is that an opportunity where these tracking systems can help improve that?
Yeah, I think so. The last thought I had was, I think the hard part with this is, funny, Mohamed, you asked me the question earlier about CDS, was it the implementation? I mean, I think for peer learning right now, it is some of the implementations, because a lot of times the cases that are, if you have a system that automatically feeds you a case for peer learning, it is almost never anonymous, right? You know who the radiologist was that read the previous case. And I think that's part of where that punitive element can potentially come back in. So can AI help? I think so. We've always brainstormed these ideas of, well, what if you just reinsert these cases into the clinical workflow and reinterpret them, which is a lot of work. Is there a way to do peer learning, perhaps in parallel, but in a way that, it's powered by AI, it selects cases in a relevant way, either to the person that's doing the reviewing, to the particular diagnosis. There might be different ways to approach it. But I think the thing that is important is that we have to figure out ways to do this that integrate into the workflow. Because again, anything, and we see this in so many use cases, right? Anything that takes the radiologist away from their interpretive task to require them to log into a different system, to go to a different, solution, any of those interruptive things, in some cases, add to more errors. They certainly add to more frustration. So I think that's the challenge with trying to do peer learning with AI, is to figure out how to do it in a way that it can just seamlessly fit into our regular clinical day.
Thank you. If Mohamed doesn't have a question, I have one. It's a bit of a digression, because you had mentioned when we were talking about the radiation exposure management software, and you alluded, and you mentioned this in the chapter, that you went down the path of building it yourself. And I'm curious about that journey, and if you could explain kind of why you chose to go down that model versus buying something. And then long term, do you think it saved money in the long run, or do you think the resource time to maintain and so on, kind of evened out in the long run? Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's always the tricky part, right? With build versus buy, is there's this notion that, well, if you build it in-house, then it's free, so to speak, or cheap. But everybody forgets that first you build it, then you have to support it. And that part is not free and sometimes not cheap. In the case of REM, this was 2010. You couldn't buy REM software in 2010. David Clooney had PixelMed and we built Radiance. And the reason for that was honestly because we needed a solution. We wanted to see if it was even feasible to develop a solution. And, we were just fortunate that the approach that we took worked, because there were many steps in that process that could just as easily have not worked. And I was lucky that they did. But there were no alternatives at the time. And soon after that, by 2011, there started to be alternatives. But that was really the reason why we chose build instead of buy, is because buy really wasn't a possibility. We transitioned to a commercial solution, I believe, within a few years after that, probably 2012, 2013. And we kept running our own homegrown solution for a couple of years after that. But again, as soon as, attention stopped being paid to it, it ran for a while. And then, when you get new equipment, you have to update things. And there just wasn't time. There weren't resources anymore at that point. So I think in the short term, it probably saved us a little bit. But in the long term, it just made more sense to have a solution that was vendor supported, that was easily expanded to incorporate new equipment, firmware updates, things like that.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Did you ever do it again? Or was that the one time? I'm curious if it was an experience you wanted to repeat again, or?
Me personally, I haven't built as much software since then, certainly not at that scale. But I have a team of developers that has a whole host of in-house applications for various things. And again, they've all started out because there isn't a commercial alternative. And in some cases, even though there have since been commercial alternatives developed, our solution is just so customized to us that we have been reluctant to give up many of those applications.
I should say that I've been privy to meeting some of Tessa's teammates who work on developing applications in past years at SIIM, and they've built some really cool things over the year. Definitely kind of stuff that makes me drool as a full-time geek.
Yeah, absolute rock stars. Shout out to Darko and Charlie. I've been very fortunate to work with them for somewhere between 6 and 10 years now. It's pretty crazy. Time flies. But yeah, they're both brilliant and very creative and work incredibly hard to to build new cool things and support the things that we have, because that's one of those, with build versus buy. It's either hand it off or maintain it. And I think that's something that a lot of big academic centers are struggling with. Is it's great to have, an innovation hub and to build these new things, but where do they go once you've built them?
Yeah. So one thing that came up earlier in the conversation, and I wanted to circle back to it, is findings in radiology, both critical and non-critical. So if you want to just maybe tell our listeners, generally speaking at a high level, what are the key challenges and solutions for managing critical results, especially in terms of communication and documentation? And then the flip side is for non-critical results, how do you think software can actually support managing those non-critical findings?
So critical results have a very different workflow for us. It's a critical result. In most cases, categories of critical result are defined in the ACR practice parameters and technical guidelines. Every practice probably has even a more discrete list of critical findings. And basically, by definition, a critical finding is something where you open up a case, you see this finding, you're picking up the phone and calling the ordering team in many cases, before you've dictated the study. If it's a chest x-ray or something like that, maybe a little different, but it's typically something that could hurt the patient, in minutes to hours. And you want to communicate that information to someone who can do something about it as soon as possible. So the workflow for critical results for most practices is synchronous. You pick up the phone, you talk to a person, you document who you spoke to, when, and on what date. And that documentation typically, at least for us, goes into our reports. And we have certain templates that we use for critical findings versus non-critical findings so that we can, monitor our communication and our documentation. Non-critical findings are different. They're still actionable. So they could hurt the patient in, days to months, or some cases even years, but they're not going to hurt the patient today. And so the urgency for the communication is very different, but the importance of the communication still exists. And so for non-critical actionable findings, then you have the option of using a variety of asynchronous communication options. And there are a variety of those available in commercial solutions, whether it's text messages, whether it's, inbox messages into the medical record, whether it's some sort of voicemail application. And we have a variety of those in our workflow. The difference there is because it's asynchronous, there needs to be a way to close the loop. And sometimes the solution will close the loop automatically. But then if you still choose to pick up the phone and talk to a referring clinician, then you've got to close the loop yourself. And so again, we are, required certainly in our practice to document these things in our reports. The nice thing about having a variety of asynchronous solutions is that you can try different approaches for different clinicians. Our clinical colleagues can, certainly have a preference as to how they want to be communicated with. Really, the important thing is to make sure that the loop actually gets closed. And so commercial solutions that help with that can be really helpful, that, ping you if a message hasn't been acknowledged or hasn't been delivered or something like that, because that's how patients then start to fall through the cracks, because these follow-ups can, happen months or a year later, sometimes even 2 years later. And if that messaging doesn't happen at the beginning, you're kind of already starting off on the back foot.
Thanks, Tessa. So far in this discussion, we've touched on a lot of different areas about opportunities to have an impact on quality improvement, like the critical results, peer review, radiation exposure management, CDS. Are there any other areas where informatics could help improve or enhance patient safety in radiology that you can foresee or that you see on the horizon?
So there are definitely ways throughout the quality improvement process, Jason, for informatics to play a pretty substantial supporting role. And it's often, when you get, certainly here at home, I work very closely with our vice chair of quality. I mean, it also helps that we are old friends, but separately, we also work very closely together, because there is an opportunity in so much of quality improvement to do data-driven improvement. And in fact, that is part of, the PDSA cycle or any other approach you might take to quality improvement, is measuring a current state, characterizing a problem, and then being able to measure the impact of an intervention. And so there's a real opportunity for informatics solutions and tools to support these processes. I think specifically, aside from a lot of what we've talked about, one thing we haven't really talked about very much is structured and standardized reporting. And I think there's a real role there to, again, impact the way we deliver care, because if we can better communicate our results to referring clinicians, to patients, that, leads to a lot less ambiguity and can just help to move the care process along more effectively. So that's one area, that's one use case that definitely comes to mind. Another is related to standardization of protocols, and that's something that we've worked very hard to do. Again, the challenge comes in, the bigger the organization, the harder this is to do, because not only will you have equipment from multiple vendors, you will have equipment at different sites, even if it is all from one vendor. It's still at different sites. It's probably different generations of equipment. And so to be able to standardize protocols across sites can be very challenging. Everybody does some sort of multidisciplinary conference, whether it's tumor board specifically or just getting together with clinical colleagues who are the consumers of a particular area of radiology. So, for me, I work very closely with our cardiologists, our vascular surgeons, and our cardiothoracic surgeons. And so having solutions that support multidisciplinary conferences, I think, can be very useful as well.
I want to ask a slightly strange question here. So COVID has obviously had a massive shift in how a lot of things are done and made us realize a lot of things. In your opinion, do you feel like consultation tools have evolved during COVID, especially when it comes to facilitating remote radiology collaboration?
I think there was a time a couple of years ago where we really needed them. I remember early in the pandemic trying to do a complex congenital case at another hospital, because normally there would have been a radiologist there, but because of COVID, there wasn't a radiologist there. I had the technologist take her phone and FaceTime me and point her phone at the CT console so that I could help acquire the study in the right way. Smartphone aside, that was the low-tech solution for doing this, right? I think, as with so many things, COVID showed us opportunities for developing a lot of these solutions. I don't know to what extent we use them or depend on them to the same degree as we did at the height of the pandemic, but certainly we've had the opportunity to develop tools that can be very helpful. There's a lot of remote scanning capabilities now where a tech can actually run a scan, even if they're not sitting in the control room looking at the piece of equipment. Certainly collaboration tools. A lot of our multidisciplinary conferences are done over a web conference now that were almost always done in person. And so I think, there's certainly some opportunities to do those in a slightly more efficient way. I think mostly what people do anymore is they share the screen with PACS, and then they say, right, we're going to talk about this patient, and you pull up a whole bunch of cases. But, PACS is not necessarily maybe designed for screen sharing, and certainly not when you're sharing a portrait orientation monitor into a web conference. Things start to look a little strange. So I think there's still an opportunity. I don't know that there is the same degree of urgency associated with this particular use case. But so much of what we used to do in person, we now do either in a hybrid format or in a virtual format. And so having some tools to facilitate that, I think, are certainly desirable, but, they may not be sort of the highest priority for people because we're making do with what we have.
Well, thank you very much, Tessa. This has been a really fun conversation, and I think we're at the end of our questions, but I wanted to throw it to you if you have any closing thoughts that you wanted to share before we close out.
Jason and Mohamed, it was great chatting with you both. One final thought, I think especially with the pace with which our field is moving these days, I think this is one of the most fun things about imaging informatics is being able to build new and innovative tools that can change our workflow, impact how we deliver care, improve the way that we teach the next generation. And I think it's important to be open to these opportunities and these use cases, even though some of them might seem small, because I think the potential impact from a lot of these is really significant. And so I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you both today about Ancillary software and what it can do for us.
Thank you.
SIIMcast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics in Medicine. Please visit our website at SIIM.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at sim_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.